For decades, Gone with the Wind wasn't just one of Hollywood's greatest movies. It became the way millions of people remembered the American South. It won awards, broke box office records, and turned its stars into legends. But behind its sweeping romance and unforgettable performances was a story Hollywood spent generations avoiding. A story about the people who made it, the history it rewrote, and the truths almost nobody was allowed to say out loud. To understand how one of the most celebrated films ever made became one of the most controversial, you have to go back to one extraordinary night. On a cold February night in 1940, in a Los Angeles hotel ballroom soft with gold light and thick with famous faces, the most talked about woman in American movies sat at a small table pushed against the far wall, away from the people she had made the picture with. She was there because she had earned the right to be there, and nowhere else. The picture she had helped make was the biggest thing Hollywood had ever done. It was about to win almost everything an industry could give a film in a single evening. And the woman by the wall was about to win a prize no person like her had ever won, an honor that would put her name in the history books forever. Her name was Hattie McDaniel. She was 46 years old, the daughter of two people who had been born the property of other people. In a few minutes, she would rise from that little table, walk the long way across a room, did not want her walking through the middle of it, and stand at a microphone in front of the same industry that had told her that very night where a woman of her color was allowed to sit. The film everyone had come to celebrate was called Gone with the Wind. Think about that room for a second. The chandeliers, the furs, the men in black tie who owned the studios, and the men in black tie who ran them. Somewhere among them sat the producer who had nearly killed himself making the thing. Somewhere sat the pale, exhausted young English actress who had carried it and lost 12 pounds and part of her sanity doing so. And over against the wall, in a blue gown with white gardenias in her hair, sat the performer whose few scenes would outlast all of them, kept apart by a rule so ordinary in that time that most of the people in the room did not even notice it. That is the beginning of the forbidden truth. Not one truth, many layered on top of one another like coats of paint, until the thing underneath could not be seen at all. The film was beautiful. That was true, and it was never in doubt. The film was also a lie about the most terrible chapter in the country's past, a lie so warm and so well made that for 2 generations it did the work of history for millions of Americans who never opened a book about the war. That was true too, and the people who gave the film its deepest, truest human moments, the black actors who stood in front of the cameras, were treated by the machine that celebrated them as something less than the story it was telling them to play. Nobody in that ballroom was going to stand up and say any of it. You could not say it, not that night, not in Atlanta 3 months earlier, not for a very long time after. The saying of it was forbidden, not by any single law, but by an agreement so wide and so old that almost everyone had stopped noticing they were keeping it. So to understand the woman at the small table, you have to go back, not to the premiere, and not to the cameras, and not even to the search for the perfect scarlet that filled the newspapers for 2 years. You have to go back further than all of it, to a quiet house in Atlanta, and a woman who was writing down the only history anyone had ever given her. Because before there was a film, there was a book, and before there was a book, there was a story America had already decided to tell itself about who it had been. Her name was Margaret Mitchell, and she was small, sharp, and easily bored. She had grown up in Atlanta in the years when the Civil War was not yet history to the people around her. It was memory. It was the old men on the porches who had fought in it, the aunts who had lost brothers to it, the grandmothers who had watched the city burn and never quite got over the watching. When Margaret was a little girl, she would sit on the bony knees of Confederate veterans and listen to them talk. And it took her years to understand something that would shape everything she ever wrote. Nobody had told her the South had lost. The old men told her about the charges and the flags and the gallantry. They told her about the brave boys and the beautiful ladies and the great houses. What they did not talk about, what the whole warm circle of memory left out, was why the war had been fought at all. They talked around the center of it, the way a family talks around a shameful thing. And a child absorbing all of that does not learn to lie. She learns that the lie is simply the shape of the truth, the only shape it comes in. Margaret was not a hateful woman. That part matters, and it is easy to miss. She was a former newspaper reporter with a good ear and a fast mind, married, restless, and laid up for a long stretch with a bad ankle that would not heal. To fill the empty hours she began, almost by accident, to set down a novel about the world the old veterans had described, a world of plantations and bells, and a war that swept it all away. She did not think it was any good. She did not think anyone would ever read it. For years, she barely admitted she was writing it at all. She had one great gift and one great blindness, and they were the same thing. Her gift was that she could make the old lost world feel absolutely real, warm and green and doomed, so real you could smell the earth. Her blindness was that she believed it. She wrote the plantation exactly as the old men had remembered it, which is to say she wrote it as a kind of paradise, a place of loyalty and grace, where the enslaved people were happy and the masters were kind, and the only thing that ever broke the peace came riding down from the north. That was not something she invented. It was the water she swam in. Margaret herself was more interesting than the world she wrote about. She was a small woman with a big laugh and a reporter's nose for a good story. In the years after the Great War, she had bobbed her hair and shortened her skirts and scandalized proper Atlanta, a debutante who would not behave, once dancing a number at a charity ball so daring that the older ladies of the city never quite forgave her. She married badly the first time, to a charming man with a bootlegger's habits and a temper to match, and better the second time, to a steady, gentle newspaperman named John Marsh, who believed in her long before she believed in herself. She had worked as a reporter for the Atlanta paper, chasing stories, sitting across from strangers and learning to listen, learning above all to get the small facts right. Then a run of injuries, a bad ankle that would not mend among them, laid her up at home, with the hours stretching empty in front of her. John kept bringing her books from the library to fill the time, stacks of them, until one day he told her there was nothing left in Atlanta she had not already read, and if she wanted a new book she had better write it herself. So she did, in her own strange way. She wrote the last chapter first and the rest in pieces, out of order, the way a memory comes back. She kept the reporter's habit of checking everything she could check. The price of a bolt of cloth in the war years, the date of a battle, the color of a soldier's coat, and she stuffed the finished chapters into fat manila envelopes and hid them around the house, under the towels, behind the sofa cushions, whisking them out of sight whenever company came, as though the manuscript were something to be ashamed of, rather than the thing that would make her name known in every country on earth. By the time Margaret was a young woman, the country had already fallen in love with that version of the story. There was a myth with a name, though most people who believed it would not have called it a myth. Historians would later call it the lost cause. It held that the war had not really been about slavery at all, that it had been about honor and states and a gentle way of life, that the men who fought for the South were noble and the men who beat them were brutes, and that slavery itself had been a mild, almost kindly thing, more like a big troubled family than a system of chains. Every part of that was false, and nearly everyone Margaret knew accepted every part of it as plainly true as the weather. She had also grown up in the shadow of a film. In 1915, when Margaret was a teenager, a director named D.W. Griffith had made a picture called The Birth of a Nation, drawn from a novel by a Southern minister named Thomas Dixon. It was a technical marvel and a piece of poison. It showed the men of the Ku Klux Klan as heroes riding to rescue the white South from freed black people painted as brutes and fools. It was the first film ever screened at the White House. It made Klansmen into matinee idols and helped bring the real Klan roaring back to life across the country. Margaret would have breathed that in as a girl. Dixon's ideas were in the air she wrote in, and years later, when her own book became a sensation, Dixon himself would write her a fan letter, delighted to see the old story told again. And here is the thing that made the myth so strong. It was not only the South that wanted to believe it. The North wanted to believe it too. After the war, after the brief hard years when the country tried to make the freed people truly free and then gave up, white America, top to bottom, coast to coast, made a quiet bargain with itself. It would heal the wound between North and South by agreeing to forget what the war had really been about. The gray soldiers and the blue soldiers would clasp hands over the graves and call each other brave, and the whole nation would nod along to a gentle story about honor and reunion. And the people that story left out, the 4 million who had been owned, would be swept quietly to the edge of the picture. The reunion of white America was purchased with the memory of Black America. Everyone in the country was invited to feel good about the past, so long as nobody looked too hard at the one part that could not be made to feel good. Margaret Mitchell did not invent that bargain. She was born into it. Her whole country had signed it before she was old enough to read. So when Margaret Mitchell sat on her couch with a bad ankle and a stack of hidden envelopes, she was not writing history. She thought she was, and that is the sad human part. She had done real research. She had checked dates and battles and the price of goods. What she could not check, what no amount of research would have shown her, was the thing she had been taught to leave out. She wrote a masterful, gripping, deeply felt novel about a world that had never existed the way she believed it had. Gone with the Wind came out in the summer of 1936, and it did not sell like a book. It sold like water in a drought. 1 million copies in the first 6 months, in the middle of the Great Depression, when $1 was hard to come by, and most people counted everyone. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It became the thing everyone was reading, and everyone was talking about. And its heroine, a green-eyed, hard-hearted, unbreakable young woman named Scarlett O'Hara, became a name the whole country knew. Margaret was miserable about all of it. She hated the fame. She thought the book was unfilmable, 1,000 pages that no studio could ever fit onto a screen, and she told people so. She wanted to be left alone in Atlanta with her husband and her privacy, and she got neither, because a book that big does not stay a book for long. Out in Hollywood, a young story editor was already reading a synopsis of it and reaching for a telegram. The forbidden truth had just found its way onto paper. Now it was about to be carved into light. The story editor was named Kay Brown, and she worked for one of the strangest, most gifted, most self-destroying men in the history of the movies. In May of 1936, before the book had even reached the stores, she read a summary of it and part of the unfinished manuscript, and she fired off a message to her boss that was almost a plea. She called it a magnificent story. She told him to buy it at once. Her boss was David O. Selznick, and to understand the film you have to understand him, because more than any director, more than any star, Gone with the Wind is his. He was 34 years old, and he was chasing a ghost. His father, Louis Selznick, had been one of the wild early kings of the silent film business, a man who made a fortune and lost every penny of it in a crash so complete that people still whispered about it. David grew up watching his father rise like a rocket and fall like a stone, and he came out of it with a hunger that never emptied. He wanted to prove that a Selznick could build something that lasted. He wanted to be not a businessman who sold films, but an artist who made them, a producer whose name on a picture meant as much as any director's. That was the defining thing about him. He believed a film could have a single author, and he believed that author was the producer, and he believed that producer was him. In 1935, he had walked away from the safety of MGM, the biggest studio in town, to start his own company and answer to no one. His confidence was total, his taste was real, and his fatal flaw was hiding right inside his greatest strength. He could see everything. That was the trouble. He could see the exact shade of a dress, and the exact width of a door, and the exact word a character should say in the exact moment. And he had to control all of it, every hair and every button, or he could not rest. He worked through the nights on a drug called Benzedrine to keep going, dictating memos by the hundred, memos so long and so detailed that they are still famous, telling everyone how to do everything. He could see every single detail of the picture he was making. He simply could not see the one enormous thing sitting in the center of it. His father is worth pausing on, because David spent his whole life either running from the old man or trying to outdo him. Louis Selznick had come to America with almost nothing, clawed his way into the wild early film trade, and made himself rich, and he spent the money as fast as it arrived, on the theory that a poor boy who strikes it rich should live like it. Or what was the point? He once told his sons that the only thing to do with money was spend it, that there was always more where that came from. Then one day there was not more. The business turned against him, the fortune drained away, the big house empty, and Louis Selznick went broke so loudly and so completely that in Hollywood the family name became a kind of shorthand for a man who had it all and threw it away. David watched every bit of that as a boy, the rocket and the crash, and it left two fires burning in him that never went out. One was a plain terror of ending up like his father, laughed at and ruined. The other was a stubborn faith that he could do it right, that if a Selznick simply held every rein and let nothing out of his own hands, the fall would never come for him. So he held everything. He wrote memos the way other men breathe, thousands upon thousands of pages, telling every carpenter and cameraman and actress exactly how to do the job, which word to change, which lamp to move, how long a silence should last. Those memos are famous now, gathered into books, studied like a holy text. They are also the sound of a man who could not bear to trust anyone else to carry anything, because the last person he had trusted to run things was his father, and everyone had seen how that ended. He was in Hawaii on holiday when Kay Brown's message reached him, and at first he said no. He was nervous about the price, which had climbed toward $50,000, an enormous sum for a book, more than anyone had paid for a story before. He was nervous about the subject, because films about the Civil War had a habit of losing money. What finally changed his mind was not love of the book. It was fear that someone else would buy it. On the 6th of July in 1936, a week after the novel appeared in stores, he paid the $50,000 and owned the most wanted story in America. Then he had to figure out how to turn 1,000 pages into a movie, and the trouble began. And it did not stop for 3 years. He hired a serious man for the job, a Pulitzer-winning playwright named Sidney Howard, and let him work in peace on his farm in Massachusetts. Howard delivered a script in the spring of 1937, and it was a monster. 400 pages, close to 6 hours of screen time, far too much to film. That was fine. That was normal. The trouble was Selznick himself. He could not leave the script alone. He sent Howard notes by the ream, demanded changes, rethought scenes he had already approved, and slowly wore the playwright down, until Howard walked away from the whole exhausting business. After Howard came the parade. Selznick cycled through writer after writer, some of the finest in the country, chewing through them and spitting them out. Oliver Garrett came and went, John Van Drute, Joe Swirling, Charles MacArthur, even F. Scott Fitzgerald, the great novelist, then broke and drinking and working for hire in Hollywood, took a turn on it, and Selznick made him cut every word that had not come straight from Margaret Mitchell's book, so that Fitzgerald spent his days striking out his own lines in favor of hers. None of it satisfied the producer. There was no finished script. There was never going to be a finished script. Not really, because the man in charge could not stop reaching in to fix it. Fitzgerald's turn on it is a small heartbreak all by itself. He had been the golden voice of the jazz age, the man who gave the decade its name, and now he was middle-aged and drinking hard and out of money, taking studio work by the week to pay his debts. Selznick handed him Gone with the Wind and told him he could use no words except Margaret Mitchell's own. So the finest prose stylist of his generation spent his days striking out his own sentences and hunting through 1,000 pages of another writer's book for lines he was permitted to keep. He lasted about 2 weeks. He is supposed to have said that he could not make Mitchell's dialogue any better, only worse, so there was really no reason for him to be there at all. The strangest chapter of all came when Selznick, only weeks from disaster with cameras already rolling, shut the whole enormous machine down and locked himself in a room with a writer named Ben Hecht, one of the fastest pens in Hollywood, who happened to have one small problem. Hecht had never read the book, so Selznick and Fleming acted the entire story out for him, scene by scene, playing every part themselves, the producer flinging himself into Scarlett and Rhett and Mammy, while Hecht sat at the typewriter and turned the performance into pages. They worked 5 days without a real break, 18 and 20 hours at a stretch, and they would not stop for proper meals, living on bananas and salted peanuts that Selznick was sure kept the mind sharp. Fleming threw himself into acting out the scenes so hard that a blood vessel burst in his eye. That is how the first half of the most beloved film of its age got its shooting script. 3 exhausted men in a locked room, one of them typing a book he had never read, all of them living on peanuts. Underneath all that chaos lay the patient work of one man who never got to see what he had built. Sidney Howard, a serious and respected playwright, had done the first real screenplay, wrestling Mitchell's 1,000 pages down into something that could actually be filmed. And though a small army of others cut and pasted and rewrote on top of him, the bones of the picture stayed his. He got tired of Selznick's endless meddling and went home to his farm in the Northeast. And there, in the summer of 1939, before the film he had shaped was ever shown to the public, Sidney Howard was killed in an accident on that farm, crushed by his own tractor. When the credits finally rolled at the premiere, his was the only name on the screenplay. And when the awards came, the writing prize went to a dead man. He had given the film its shape and its spine, and he did not live to hear a single audience gasp at it. The money was the other fire, and it burned hotter every month. By the middle of 1938, Selznick had spent something like $400,000 of his own and had almost nothing to show for it. No script he trusted, no Scarlett, and no Rhett Butler, though there had only ever been one man the whole country wanted in the part, and Selznick knew it. The man everyone wanted was Clark Gable, and Gable was under contract to MGM, the studio Selznick had walked away from, the studio run by a hard, brilliant, unsentimental man named Louis B. Mayer, who happened to be Selznick's own father-in-law. There is a whole small drama just in that fact. Selznick had left MGM precisely to get out from under Mayer, to prove that a Selznick could stand on his own and did not need the most powerful man in Hollywood holding the strings. And now, the one actor the whole country demanded for the biggest picture of his life belonged to that exact man. To get Gable, Selznick had to walk back into his father-in-law's office, cap in hand, and ask. In August of 1938, he made the deal, and it saved the picture, and quietly cost him a great deal of what he had left MGM to win. Mayer would loan him Gable, and put up more than $1 million toward the budget, a fortune that made the whole thing possible. In return, MGM took the right to distribute the film and half of its profits for 7 years. Selznick got his Rhett and his money. Mayer got the lion's share of the greatest moneymaker in the history of the movies, and the deep satisfaction, one imagines, of watching the son-in-law who had struck out on his own come home needing him after all. The public would remember Gone with the Wind as David Selznick's triumph. It was also in the ledgers Louis B. Mayer's. The deal took most of 2 years to assemble, and that is part of why the search for Scarlett could run so long and so loud. Selznick did not merely tolerate the delay, he fed on it. Every month he could not begin was another month of headlines, another round of hopeful girls, and breathless newspaper columns, the picture growing in the public mind before a single foot of it existed. It was the only way. Selznick did not have the money on his own, and he knew it, and he swallowed his pride and signed. The father he could never impress had built and lost an empire. Now the son had built his own studio and had to crawl back to his wife's father to keep his dream alive. There is a whole life inside that deal, if you look. He had his Rhett, he had his money. What he did not have, with cameras due to roll and the whole country watching, was the one thing the entire enterprise was named for. He did not have a Scarlett, and the search for her would become the most famous casting hunt Hollywood ever ran. Here is where the story turns into something almost mad, and almost beautiful, and very American. Selznick decided that if he could not find his Scarlett, he would let the whole country look for her with him. He put his publicity man to work and launched a nationwide search, sending scouts into the South, holding open calls, inviting unknown girls to dream out loud. Over 2 years, his people talked to something near 1,400 women. They ran real screen tests on about 30 of them. It cost around $100,000, and much of it was a stunt, a way to fill the papers and stall for time, while the money and the casting sorted themselves out. It was a stunt that told a deeper truth. By the time the cameras were ready, half of America felt that Scarlett O'Hara belonged to them, that they had a stake in who would play her, that a wrong choice would be a kind of theft. A green-eyed girl from a made-up plantation had become a national possession. People wrote letters, people had opinions. The picture had not shot a single frame, and it was already the most anticipated film in the world. The list of women who wanted the part reads like a roll call of the age. Bette Davis was a public favorite, and Warner Brothers tried to package her with their own Errol Flynn. But Davis would not take Flynn as her Rhett, and soon went off to play a Southern belle in another film instead, which put her out of the running. Katharine Hepburn wanted it badly and pushed hard for it, backed by the director Selznick had first hired. But Selznick could not picture Rhett Butler chasing her across a decade. Paulette Goddard came closer than anyone, tested beautifully, even in color, and nearly had it, until the question of whether she was really legally married to Charlie Chaplin turned into a scandal Selznick did not want. Tallulah Bankhead, Joan Bennett, Susan Hayward, a young Lana Turner whose test lifted her career, Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford, name after name. Margaret Mitchell herself, when asked, quietly favored an actress named Miriam Hopkins and was gently told she was too old for a girl of 16. The hunt became a kind of national theater. Selznick's publicity, men sent word ahead that scouts were coming, and in town after town across the South, the girls lined up around the block, farmers' daughters and shop clerks and church sopranos, each one certain she was the Scarlet America had been waiting for. The scouts spoke, by the end, to something like 1,400 hopefuls. They shot expensive color tests of the serious contenders, reel after reel of famous actresses in period gowns, delivering Scarlet's lines. A fortune in film burned just to choose one face. A handful got a real test. Most got a few minutes, a kind word, and a train ticket home. That was, in part, the whole design of it. Every hopeful girl and every let-down little town made a headline, and every headline kept the picture burning in the public mind through the long months, while Selznick stalled for the money and the leading man he actually needed. By the time the search ended, the studio had spent something close to $100,000 just looking. An ordinary film's whole budget poured into the hunt for a single actress, and Selznick had turned the finding of Scarlett O'Hara into the longest-running advertisement in the history of the movies. He was selling the picture to the whole country before he had shot a foot of it, and the country was buying, ticket already half in hand. Rhett had his own near misses too, and one of them tastes sweeter with time. Before the deal for Gable came together, Selznick had considered Gary Cooper for the part, and Cooper turned it down flat and told people the whole thing was going to be the biggest flop in Hollywood history. He was glad, he said, that it would be Clark Gable falling on his face and not Gary Cooper. It is the sort of thing a man says out loud and then spends years quietly hoping the world has forgotten. While the country argued about Scarlett, the man who would be Rhett was dreading the whole thing. Clark Gable in 1938 was the biggest male star in the world, and he did not want the part everyone was sure he was born to play. Understand who he was first. He had come up hard, an Ohio boy who had worked the oil fields and knocked around in tent shows and made himself into the picture of easy American manhood. The grin, the ears, the shrug. A man who looked like he had never doubted anything in his life. That was the image. Underneath it was a man riddled with worry that he was a fraud, sure that any day the whole country would see through him. He had bad teeth and false ones that gave him trouble. He was in the middle of an expensive divorce, and he read the fever around Rhett Butler and felt not pride but fear. He thought it was a woman's picture, and he thought that would soften his tough guy standing. Most of all, he was afraid he could not be the Rhett that millions of readers had already built in their heads. The perfect rogue they carried around like a memory. He reportedly never even finished the book. Every instinct told him to run. What kept him in was money and Mayer's cleverness. The studio dangled the fee, and the story goes, helped smooth his costly divorce and gave him the time off he wanted to marry the woman he loved, the funny, foul-mouthed, wonderful actress Carole Lombard. So Gable took the part he feared, for reasons that had little to do with wanting it. He would give the performance of his life, terrified the whole time that it was not good enough. The Scarlet hunt dragged into its final winter with no Scarlet. And then, on a December night in 1938, on a back lot in Culver City, the answer walked out of the firelight. Selznick had already spent months planning the film's most enormous scene, the burning of Atlanta, the moment the war reaches the city and the world comes apart. He could not build a whole new Atlanta just to set it on fire, so he did something clever and a little insane. He took the old sets that had been standing on the lot for years, the leftover jungle from King Kong, the ancient walls from other pictures, dressed the fronts of them to look like Atlanta, and burned them all to the ground in one huge controlled blaze, with stunt doubles standing in for Scarlett and Rhett in a runaway carriage. Because he still had no Scarlett to actually film, he lit the biggest fire in the history of the movies to that point, before he even knew who his leading lady was. Picture the scale of that night. It was the 10th of December in 1938, and Selznick had gathered nearly every Technicolor camera in Hollywood, because there were only a few in existence, and he needed all of them at once. Since the fire could only be lit a single time, firemen stood ready, ambulances waited, doubles in period costume sat in a horse-drawn carriage that would race down a street, with walls of flame on either side, because there was still no Scarlett and no Rhett to put in the shot. Then the gas lines opened and the old sets went up, 40 acres of them, the leftover ramparts of King Kong, and the walls of a dozen forgotten pictures, 40-foot flames climbing into the black California sky. The blaze was so enormous that the glow could be seen for miles, and people across Los Angeles telephoned to report that the whole town was burning, that Culver City was lost. Selznick stood there watching a fortune go up in real fire to fake the fall of a city, and it worked, and it is still one of the most frightening things in the film. He had bet the picture on a fire he could not take back, before he had a star to stand in front of it. That is the kind of nerve, and the kind of madness the whole project ran on. His brother Myron, a Hollywood agent, showed up on the lot that night with a client on his arm. As the flames climbed and lit the whole sky orange, Myron brought the young woman over to his brother, and the story goes said something like, "Meet your Scarlett." David Selznick looked at the face in the firelight and felt something move. Her name was Vivien Leigh, and she was the last thing anyone expected. She was British, 25 years old, born Vivian Mary Hartley in India to English parents. She was small and dark and delicate looking, with a face that could hold stillness and storm in the same second. She was not really a movie star. She was a stage actress who thought the theater was the only serious art, and the movies a lesser trade. She was also deeply, dangerously in love with a married English actor named Laurence Olivier, and half of her drive to get to Hollywood was simply to be near him. Selznick had actually noticed her in a British film months before and set her aside, thinking her too English for a Georgia girl. Her defining quality was a will like a blade, thin and bright, and able to cut through anything in front of it. She had decided she was going to have this part, and once Vivien Leigh decided a thing, the deciding was terrifying to watch. The hidden cost was buried right inside that same fierce will. The fire that got her the role was the same fire that was already, quietly, beginning to burn her down. There was an illness in her that no one yet had a name for, a mind that could climb too high and fall too far, and the punishing work ahead would coax it up out of the dark. Her color tests were extraordinary. Selznick watched them and knew. Around the turn of the new year, the choice was made, and in the middle of January of 1939, the announcement went out, and the country reacted the way you would expect a country to react. On being told that its most beloved American heroine would be played by a foreigner, there was outrage. There were angry letters about a British girl stealing Scarlett. Selznick answered it calmly, pointing out that Scarlett was written as French and Irish, hardly a pure daughter of the Old South anyway, and let Leigh's performance do the rest. It did. Within a year, no one could imagine another face. What almost nobody knew was how little of that firelight meeting had been an accident. Vivien Leigh had read the novel long before, on the far side of the ocean, and had told friends, with a calm that unsettled them, that she was going to play Scarlett O'Hara. Not that she hoped to, that she would. She had followed Olivier to America, chasing both a man and a part, and she had made sure her name was in her agent's brother's ear at exactly the right moment. She studied the accent of the American South until she could slip in and out of it at will. This Englishwoman born in India, learning to sound like a Georgia girl. The meeting by the fire looked like fate, and Selznick loved to tell it that way. The mystery woman appearing out of the flames. The truth was quieter and more impressive. A determined young actress had wanted one thing with her whole ferocious heart, and had arranged, step by careful step, to be standing in that firelight. When the man who could give it to her looked up, the last pieces fell into place. Leslie Howard, gentle and clever, and quite sure he was too old and too English, took the part of Ashley Wilkes without enthusiasm, mostly because Selznick promised to let him produce his own next film. Olivia de Havilland, warm and shrewd and only 22, wanted the part of the saintly Melanie so badly that she quietly maneuvered around her own home studio to get it, and won it, and would give the film its softest heart. The cast was set, the money was in, the script was still unbelievably half-finished, and on a January morning in 1939, after 3 years of chaos, the cameras finally began to roll on the most anticipated picture ever made. Almost at once, everything started to go wrong. The first director was George Cukor, and he had been with the project for nearly 2 years. He was a small, cultured, watchful man, famous in Hollywood as an actor's director, and above all, as a director who understood women and drew great performances out of them. Vivien Leigh and Olivia de Havilland loved him. He had coached them, listened to them, helped them find their way into Scarlett and Melanie. When the cameras rolled in late January, the two women felt they were in safe hands. 18 days later, Cukor was gone. Selznick fired him, and the official reasons were the usual ones: disagreements over the script and the pace, the producers' endless second-guessing. But there was another reason under the surface, one that says a great deal about the world these people lived in. Clark Gable was uncomfortable with Cukor, and the discomfort seems to have run deeper than any argument about camera angles. Cukor was a gay man, in an era when that had to stay hidden or it could end you, and there were whispers that he knew things about Gable's own past that Gable did not want known, from the lean years before stardom. Whether any of that was true almost does not matter. The fear of it was real, and it helped push a great director off the biggest film of the decade. Leigh and de Havilland were heartbroken and furious. There is a famous image of the two of them going to Selznick in their full costumes to beg him to keep Cukor, hoop skirts and painted faces and all, standing in the producer's office pleading for the man who understood them, and losing. They had good reason to fight. Cukor was the one who had found their way into these women. He had spent hours with each of them, drawing out the fear and the steel, treating them as artists rather than furniture. Now he was gone in 3 weeks, and the man replacing him did not work that way at all. So they did the only thing left to them. For the rest of the long shoot, on nights and on Sundays quietly, without telling the men in charge, they slipped away to Cukor's house and let him coach them in private, scene by scene, keeping the fired director secretly at the wheel of their performances, while another man collected the credit and the eventual prize. Some of the finest acting in the film was steered from a living room, off the books, by a man who had officially been thrown off the picture. And spare a thought for Cukor himself, because his story holds one of the era's quiet cruelties. He was a gay man in a time, and a town where that truth had to stay locked away, or it could end a career overnight. The whispers that helped push him off the film, the suggestion that he knew too much about a leading man's private past, were only dangerous because the whole society had agreed to treat who a person loved as a weapon. Cukor lost the biggest picture of the decade partly to a fear that had nothing to do with his talent, which was enormous, and everything to do with a secret he was never permitted to carry in the open. The man who took over was Victor Fleming, and he was pulled off another picture to do it, a small musical about a girl and a tornado called The Wizard of Oz. Fleming was everything Cukor was not. He was big and rough and tough, a men's director, a friend of Gable's who spoke his language. Gable was happier at once, Leigh was not. Where Cukor had drawn her out, Fleming pushed her, made her do take after take, and by some accounts handled her roughly, even physically adjusting her costume to change how she looked on camera. There is a story, repeated for decades and impossible to fully prove, that when Leigh once pushed back on a line, Fleming told her in the crudest possible terms exactly where she could put the script. The set that had felt like a workshop now felt like a battlefield. And then Fleming broke down too. The pressure of the thing, the heat of the lamps, the endless 18-hour days. Selznick at his shoulder every hour with a fresh memo, wore the tough man down to nothing. One day he simply could not go on. He left the picture, and the reasons given were vague. Exhaustion, nerves, a rest cure. The polite words a studio used when a man had come apart at the seams. Some who were there believed he had come frighteningly close to the edge, that the film had nearly cost him, his mind the way it was costing Leigh hers. A third director, Sam Wood, was brought in and quietly shot for weeks while Fleming recovered. So that for a stretch, two directors were working the same enormous picture in shifts to keep it moving. Added up, and the arithmetic is almost comic. One director was fired and then kept coaching the actresses in secret. A second directed the bulk of it and broke down in the middle. A third filled the gap for weeks. And a fourth man, the designer Menzies, had drawn the whole film in advance and shaped how nearly every frame would look. 4 men had a hand on the wheel of this thing. Yet when it was finished and the prizes were handed out, one name alone would sit on the screen as director, and that one man alone would carry home the Oscar for a picture that had passed through so many hands that no single person could honestly say he had made it. Even the credit at the heart of it was, in its way, a tidy story told over a much messier truth. That was the house style of the whole production. Make the seams disappear. Make it look like one clean, beautiful, inevitable thing. Above all of them, never sleeping, sat Selznick rewriting. He rewrote the script at night and handed the new pages down in the morning, so that the actors often did not know their lines until the day they had to say them. Some call sheets simply read, "Script to come," and the cast learned to arrive ready for anything. He second-guessed shots that were already in the can and ordered them done again. He fired off memos to everyone at every hour, on the color of a ribbon, the angle of a hat, the exact beat of a pause, leaving the crew to wonder when the man ever slept. The answer was that he mostly did not. He kept himself upright on a stimulant and on nerve, running the largest picture in the world, by refusing to let 1 inch of it out of his own hands. It should have collapsed a dozen times, somehow held together by his sleepless will and everyone else's exhaustion. It did not. That is how the most beloved film of its era was actually made. Not in calm, but in a fever. One long fever that ran for the better part of a year. The physical scale of it was staggering, and every hard thing about it was made harder by the times. They shot in 3-strip Technicolor, a new and difficult process that needed blinding, roasting banks of light, so the sound stages became ovens, and everyone sweated through their period clothes. Whole streets of old Atlanta were built on the back lot. Vast sets rose and were dressed and were torn down again. Hundreds of extras were hired and costumed and arranged. Wounded soldiers and dancing couples and fleeing townsfolk, each one needing a period outfit and a place to stand. The first cameraman was replaced a month in because Selznick wanted the color richer and warmer, less shadowed, to match the heat of the feelings on screen, and the men who took over would win the prize for it. The costume designer, Walter Plunkett, made something like 5,500 separate pieces of clothing and dressed Scarlett in colors that darkened as her fortunes darkened, so that the story was told in cloth as much as in words. The production designer, William Cameron Menzies, drew nearly every shot in advance, deciding the look of the whole picture frame by frame, which almost no one had ever done before, and earned a special award of his own for the doing of it. Even the dirt was a fight. The red clay of Georgia was part of the story's soul, so Selznick had red earth trucked in to dress the sets, and the dust of it got into Vivien Leigh's eyes and skin and made her sick, peeling her skin and burning her eyes, so that the very authenticity he chased was quietly poisoning his star. Consider one moment that everybody remembers, the scene where Scarlett, ruined and starving in the wreck of her home, claws a radish out of the dead garden, chokes it down, and rises against a blood-red sky to swear she will never be hungry again. It is the hinge of the whole film, the vow that carries her through the rest of it. Leigh played it worn to the bone, half sick from the dirt and the heat and the killing schedule, and by some accounts, she came close to fainting under the punishing lights while she filmed the thing. That would become the most quoted image of survival in American movies. The strength on the screen was real acting, so was the exhaustion. She was, in that shot, a woman playing a woman who refuses to break, while quietly breaking. The heat inside those sound stages has to be understood to believe it. The Technicolor cameras of the day were heavy machines that demanded a wall of arc lights so fierce and so hot that the actors wilted in their layers of period wool and corseted silk, sweat running under the makeup, everyone counting the minutes to the next break. Menzies had planned every shot in advance in colored sketches, so the crew knew exactly what image they were chasing. And Plunkett had built more than 5,000 pieces of clothing, dressing Scarlett in whites and greens when she was young and safe, and in deepening reds and blacks as her world fell apart, telling the story in cloth so quietly that most viewers felt it without ever noticing. All of that care and craft was being poured, hour after roasting hour, into a beautiful thing that was not true, and it was beautiful. That has to be said plainly, because the beauty is the whole reason the lie went so deep. Think of the images that people who saw it once still carry decades later. Scarlett and her father in black outline against a burning orange sky. The land of Tara stretched out beneath them, the camera pulling slowly back over the train yard at Atlanta, back and back, until a single wounded soldier becomes 100, then 1,000, then a whole field of broken men under a tattered Confederate flag. One of the most overwhelming shots in the history of the movies. Rhett and Scarlett silhouetted in a doorway, the great curving red staircase, and over all of it, Max Steiner's music, that soaring theme that starts up and puts a lump in your throat before a word is spoken. The film is a genuine wonder of craft. Every dollar Selznick spent, and every night he did not sleep is up there on the screen. That is exactly why it worked as it did. Nobody falls in love with a clumsy lie. They fall in love with a gorgeous one, told by beautiful people, scored like a hymn, and they carry it home in their hearts and mistake it for the truth. Yet inside all that chaos, something human kept happening between the people who were living it. Gable and Lee, who never had any romance off-screen, killed the long waits between shots by playing Battleship. The two of them hunched over their paper grids, calling out squares, and then Lee would look up and snap into Scarlett as if a switch had flipped. She teased him too. His false teeth gave him bad breath that she had to endure through every kiss, and she said so, with the frankness that made her both hard to work with and impossible not to admire. There was warmth even in the hardest scene Gable had to play. Late in the story, after a terrible loss, Rhett Butler breaks down and weeps, and Gable did not want to do it. Crying to a man of his time and his image felt like the end of him, a thing that could unman the king of Hollywood in front of the whole country. He dug in. He would not shed the tears. The whole shoot ground against that refusal, because the scene needed them, and Gable could not give them. It was Olivia de Havilland who found the way through. Gentle, watchful, and much cleverer than the sweet Melanie she played. She sat with him and coaxed and reassured, made the set feel safe enough for the biggest star in the world to fall apart inside it. He tried it one way, with his face turned from the camera, and then with her steadying him. He tried it the other way, tears and all, and it worked. And it is one of the truest things he ever did. The tough guy let himself be seen breaking, and the film is better for the moment he most dreaded. There was mischief between them too. De Havilland once rigged a hidden weight around her own waist before a scene, where Gable had to sweep her up in his arms, just to watch the great man heave and gape, and wonder why little Melanie suddenly weighed as much as a piano. He and Hattie McDaniel became real friends, and in one celebration scene, he is said to have quietly swapped real liquor into the prop glasses, so that by the last take the two of them were giggling, for reasons that had nothing to do with the script. The people making the lie were, among themselves, often genuinely kind. That is part of what makes the whole thing so hard to hold. Warmth and cruelty were running side by side on the same lot, all day long, and most of the people there could only see the warmth, but the kindness on that set could not reach the person who needed it most, because while Gable worried and Fleming raged and Selznick rewrote, the young woman at the center of every scene was quietly coming apart, and the film that would make her immortal was taking a price out of her that she would go on paying for the rest of her life. Vivien Leigh was in almost every scene of a 4-hour film, and the numbers alone tell the story. She worked something like 125 days. Gable, her co-star, the man whose face sold the picture, worked around 71. She carried the whole thing on her narrow shoulders, often 7 days a week, called to the lot before dawn to be laced and painted, working late into the night, then taken home to learn the next day's pages, and brought back a few hours later to do it again. She pushed herself harder than anyone asked her to, because she had a private reason to finish fast. Olivier was in New York, and every extra week on the set was another week apart from the man. She had crossed an ocean to be near. And here is a number that says almost everything about how Hollywood valued its people: for carrying nearly twice the workload, for being on screen in almost every frame, for giving the performance the entire film rested on. Vivien Leigh was paid a small fraction of what Gable was paid. He was the king, an established star with a powerful studio behind him, and he was worth a fortune. She was an unknown import, a bargain the producer had gotten cheap, and she was worth, on paper, a modest weekly wage. The woman doing the most and suffering the most was, in the ledger, the least expensive thing on the lot. She never much complained about the money. She wanted the part, not the paycheck. But the arithmetic of it sits there anyway, quiet and telling. The actress who won the highest prize in her profession, earning a servant's share of what the man beside her took home. So she drove herself past what a body should take. She read the novel again and again. She studied the South, the accents, the manners. She lost about 12 pounds she did not have to lose, dropping to under 100, until she looked in some shots like a woman, made of wire and will. Her assistant said nothing was ever too hard for her, that she gave the work everything. And that was exactly the problem. She had nothing left over. The body began to send up flares. She suffered blinding migraines and could not sleep. She had crying fits and mood swings that swung wider than the ordinary strain of a hard shoot could explain. She reached for sedatives to knock herself out at night, and once took too many by accident, an overdose that frightened everyone around her. Olivier, far away and worried, wrote her a scolding letter about it, the kind of letter you send when you are terrified and cannot say so plainly, telling her to take better care, and not knowing how far past careful she already was. There were reports she briefly lost the sight in one eye. The imported red dirt burned her skin and her eyes. Her period was late, and for a stretch she was terrified she was pregnant. On top of everything else, one more thing pressing down on a young woman, already carrying more than a person should. She kept a lifeline open to Olivier by telephone and by letter, pouring out to him the misery she hid from the set. There is a phone call people who knew her remembered for years. Leigh crying down the line to him about how she hated it, hated film acting, hated it with her whole heart, and never wanted to make another film as long as she lived. She thought of herself as a serious actress, a creature of the stage, and she looked at the machine of Hollywood fame with something close to scorn, even as it was busy making her the most famous woman on earth. She had wanted the part with everything in her. Now she had it, and it was eating her alive, and the only person she could tell was 3,000 miles away. What was happening to her was not only exhaustion, though it was that. Something deeper was surfacing. Years later, doctors would give it a name, the illness then called manic depression, and now called bipolar disorder, a mind that could soar and then crash into darkness. The relentless film was not the cause of it, but the film was the pressure that pulled it up out of the deep, the first great strain that showed the world and showed her what she was going to be fighting for the rest of her days. And still, she never stopped being a professional. That is the part that steadies you when you read about it. She could sit playing a child's board game with Gable, laughing, and then rise and become scarlet in a heartbeat, cold and burning and completely in control. De Havilland, who watched her up close, always defended her, always spoke of her dedication, her quick, warm intelligence, the way she could turn the storm on and off. Whatever was breaking in Vivien Leigh, she kept it off the screen. The screen only ever got the best of her, take after take, no matter what it had cost her to hand it over. That was the bargain of her, the thing that made her both magnificent and doomed. She gave the work everything, held nothing back for herself, and paid the whole bill in private, alone, on the telephone in the dark. The audience that fell in love with Scarlett O'Hara never saw the price. They saw a girl of impossible force and beauty who would not be beat. They did not see the woman behind her, sedated and sleepless and frightened, who was already beginning the long fight that would fill the rest of her short life. That is one truth the glamour hid. The most famous performance in the film was given by a woman who was fighting for her mind while she gave it, and who would come to see the whole triumph with a kind of sorrow. The camera loved her. The making of the film nearly destroyed her, and she was, in the end, the person on that set the machine treated best. Which brings us to the other cost, the one that was not private and not accidental, and not something a scolding letter or a weekend with a lover could soothe. To see it, you have to look away from the stars for a moment, past the battleship games and the red dirt and the roasting lights, over to the edge of the lot, where a different set of rules was quietly in force. The set of Gone with the Wind was segregated, the way the country was segregated, quietly and completely, and as if it were the natural order of things. The white stars had private cars to bring them to the lot. The black actors, some of them fine and famous performers in their own right, were expected to share. There were separate facilities, and at one point there were signs painted plainly, the way such signs were painted everywhere in America then, marking which bathrooms were for white people and which were for colored. The people making a warm story about a happy old South were living the cold, real thing while they did it, and most of them never blinked. It came down to 1,000 small daily arrangements, each one so ordinary to the white people around it that it barely registered. The black actors, some of them seasoned professionals with long careers, were kept to their own corners of a set that treated them as help rather than talent. They ate apart, they rested apart, they waited apart. They stepped onto the same sound stage, and when the camera stopped, stepped back into a world with a line drawn straight through it. Nobody had to enforce it with any special cruelty. It simply was the shape of everything, the way the air is the shape of the room, and it took a special effort even to notice it was there. And yet inside that hard shape, real warmth grew where it could. Hattie McDaniel and Clark Gable became genuine friends. He liked her plainly, her wit and her warmth, and the way she gave back exactly as good as she got. And she liked him, the big easy man who treated her like a person and not a prop. They traded jokes between takes. He sought out her company. When you watch the two of them on screen, the ease between Mammy and Rhett, the way she scolds him and he grins and takes it. Some of that is not acting at all. It is two people who honestly enjoyed each other, shining through a story that would never have let their characters be equals. That friendship is one of the few things about the whole production that is simply and uncomplicatedly good. It also could not change a single one of the arrangements. Gable could be her friend, and did, and still she went home each night to a segregated city, and still her photograph would be pulled from the program in Atlanta, and still the line ran straight through the middle of everything. Kindness between two people, however real, is not the same as justice between two peoples. The film and the world that made it kept confusing the one for the other. To understand what those black actors were up against, you have to understand how small the door was. In the Hollywood of 1939, a black performer, no matter how gifted, no matter how trained, could be cast in only a narrow handful of parts. The maid, the cook, the butler, the porter, the comic servant who rolled his eyes and shuffled and made the white audience feel warm and superior all at once. Leading roles were closed, romances were closed, heroes were closed. A black actor with the range to play a king or a general or a lover was, in practice, allowed to play a person who fetched things for white people and was grateful. That was the ceiling, and it was low, and it was everywhere, and it was iron. So when a part like Mammy came along, a servant's role, yes, but a meaty one, a real character with lines and screen time, and a chance to actually act, the finest black actresses in the country lined up for it, because it was the best thing on offer in a world that offered them almost nothing. They were not choosing between good roles and bad ones. They were choosing between a good version of the only role allowed and no work at all. There is a story about those signs that has been told for 80 years, and it is worth telling carefully because it is beloved and it may not be entirely true. The story goes that Clark Gable, coming upon the white and colored signs on the portable toilets, was furious and telephoned the men in charge and threatened to quit the picture on the spot. "Get those signs down," he is supposed to have said, "or you will not have a Rhett Butler in this film." And the story ends the way we want it to end. The signs came down. It is a wonderful story. Gable did have real affection for his black castmates, and he was not a cruel man, but historians who have looked hard for proof of it have not found much. It shows up in later retellings more than in the records of the time, and some of the people who were there remembered it differently or not at all. It may have happened. It may be half-true, grown taller in the telling. It may be the kind of comforting tale a guilty industry likes to tell about itself, so that the memory of the segregation comes wrapped in the memory of a hero who fixed it? The honest answer is that we do not fully know, and the fact that we reach so eagerly for the hero and hold the story so tightly is itself a small window onto how badly people wanted a clean version of a dirty thing. What is certain is who had to live inside that segregation while the cameras rolled, and what it asked of them. Start with the young woman who played Prissy, the foolish maid whose one unforgettable line, "I don't know nothing 'bout birthin' babies," has followed her name ever since. Her name was Thelma McQueen, and she called herself Butterfly, and she was a dancer with a voice like a small startled child, which is exactly why she was cast, and exactly what trapped her. She was born in 1911, and she was nobody's fool. She knew precisely what the role of Prissy was. She hated it. That one line is worth sitting with, because it shows the whole trap in a single sentence. In the scene, Melanie is in a hard labor, Scarlett needs help, and Prissy, who has boasted that she knows all about delivering babies, collapses into wailing panic and admits she knows nothing at all. It is played for a laugh, the useless, hysterical black girl, and audiences laughed for decades. What almost none of them knew was that the woman delivering the line was sharp and proud, and fully aware of what she was being asked to be, a grown woman with a fine mind, pretending to be a helpless child so that a nation could chuckle at her. She said it perfectly. That was the cruelty of her gift. She was good enough to make the demeaning thing land, and being good enough was exactly what chained her to it. She fought the small fights, which were the only fights available to her. There was a scene that called for her to eat watermelon, and she refused flatly because she knew exactly what that image was and exactly what white audiences would do with it, and she would not hand it over. She argued about a headscarf she did not want to wear. She objected to bits of business that made Prissy more of a fool than the script already did. She understood that every small surrender became a picture that would follow every black woman in America, and she said no where she could. And there was the slap. In one scene, Scarlett strikes the panicked Prissy, and in the filming of it, Vivian Leigh, deep in character, actually hit her, take after take, hard enough that McQueen was in real pain and near tears. So McQueen spoke up. She would not keep being struck for the camera, and she quietly held her ground until they worked out a way to fake the blow. It was not a victory anyone wrote about at the time. She could not change the role or the film or the country that would laugh at Prissy for the next 50 years. She could only, here and there in the few inches of room she had, refuse the very worst of it and keep a scrap of herself intact. That took a kind of courage the film would never think to honor. She paid for it anyway. The line made her famous and typecast her forever. A black woman Hollywood would only hire to play simple, squeaky, frightened maids. She grew so sick of it, so tired of being handed the same small, foolish part over and over, that she did something almost unheard of. She walked away from the movies rather than keep playing them. She would rather leave the business than keep being Prissy for the rest of her life. She made her living in other ways for years, some of them humble, and she never stopped being sharp. In her 60s, long after Hollywood had used her up, she went back to school and earned a college degree in political science because she had a fine mind and she wanted the world to know it. And being underestimated her whole life had left her with something to prove. She won an Emmy late on for a children's program. She lived plainly, spoke her mind, and made a slow, hard peace with the film that had marked her, willing in her last years to sit and talk about it as a piece of history people ought to understand, rather than a wound she needed to hide. But she never once pretended it had been anything other than what it was. Later generations, including the very men who would lead a whole movement for black dignity, would wince at Prissy on the screen. So did the woman who had played her. She had simply been made to smile and squeak and say the line first before any of them, so the rest could come after. And then there was the woman by the wall, the one this whole story keeps circling back toward. It is time to place her fully. Hattie McDaniel was born in Wichita, Kansas, in 1893, and both of her parents had been born the property of other human beings. Her father had worn the blue uniform of the Union in the very war that Gone with the Wind would later dress up as a lost paradise. He had gone to that war, a young black man with a chance at last to fight for the freedom of his own people, and he had been wounded in it, and he had carried those wounds and the poverty that came after for the rest of his hard life. Think about that for a moment, because the film never could. The woman hired to play a contented house slave, a woman meant to smile and say the old days were good days, was the daughter of a man who had bled to end those very days. She was the granddaughter of people who had actually lived slavery, not the gentle painted version in the book, but the real thing, with the auction block and the whip, and the sale of children still fresh in the family's own memory. She did not carry that history as a chip on her shoulder. She carried it as a private knowledge, a thing she knew that the whole grand production around her did not. Every day, she put on the apron of a happy slave. She was a free black woman whose own father had fought a war to make sure no more Hattie McDaniels would ever be born into chains. She said the lines, she hit the marks, and underneath, she knew exactly what the truth was, and she gave the false woman on the page a soul anyway, which may be the strangest kind of courage there is, to lend your real dignity to a lie about your own people, because it is the only door the world will open for you. The family moved to Colorado when Hattie was small, and she grew up in Denver, the youngest of 13 children, a big, warm, quick-witted girl with a giant talent and no easy road anywhere in front of her. She could sing, and she could make a room laugh, and as a girl, she won a medal for reciting a poem so well that the memory of it stayed with her for life. She wrote songs. She toured with a black musical troupe. She became one of the very first black women ever to sing on American radio. Her voice carried out over the airwaves at a time when almost no one who looked like her was allowed near a microphone. For a few years, she cut blues records, the real thing, sung by a woman who knew what the blues were about. Then came the crash of 1929, and the work dried up the way work does, and she did what she had to do to eat. She scrubbed floors, she waited tables, she took a job as a washroom attendant in a club, handing towels to white patrons, and on some lucky nights, the club would let the washroom girl come out and sing a number, and she would stop the room, and then she would go back to the towels. She knew the inside of the part she would later play in Gone with the Wind better than any writer in Hollywood ever could, because she had already lived the modern shape of it. The gifted black woman, allowed to entertain the very people who would not let her sit down among them. When she finally put on Mammy's apron, she was not reaching for something foreign. She was putting on a life she already knew from the inside. Her defining quality was dignity, and she wore it like armor because she had to. She carried herself as though no room could shrink her, and she needed that because so many rooms tried. The hidden cost was heavy and it was cruel. To make her living, she had to put on the apron and the headscarf and play, over and over, a version of black womanhood that white America found comforting. The loyal, sexless, endlessly patient servant who loved her white family more than her own freedom. She had to smile through a story that turned her grandmother suffering into set dressing, and she did it with such skill that she made the false thing feel human anyway. When she auditioned for the part of Mammy, she came dressed as a maid, in a real apron and a real headscarf, because she knew precisely what they wanted to see, and she gave it to them, and she beat out heavy competition to get it. Even in that small choice, there is a whole philosophy of survival, a woman using the world's low expectations of her as the very tool to get in the door. And here is the strange, painful genius of what she did once she was through it. The role on the page was a stereotype, the old Mammy figure, faithful and scolding, and endlessly content in her chains. But McDaniel poured something into it that no writer had put there. She gave Mammy authority. She gave her a mind, a temper, a sense of exactly who was right and who was wrong in that grand doomed house. Watch her lace Scarlett into a corset and mutter that it is not fitting for a girl to eat like a field hand at a party, and you are watching a servant who plainly runs the household and knows it. Watch her climb the stairs at the end, weeping, telling the truth about a family's grief when no one else will, and you are watching the moral center of the whole picture in an apron. That stair scene is worth stopping on, because in a film of 4 hours, filled with famous faces and grand feelings, it may be the single truest minute of acting in the whole thing. There are no tricks in it. There is no music swelling to tell you how to feel. There is only a heavy, tired woman on a staircase, carrying more sorrow than the fine people around her know how to carry, putting the family's unspeakable loss into plain words, because somebody has to. Audiences who came for Scarlett and Rhett found themselves, in that moment, watching the servant, and something in them went quiet. They may not have been able to say why. The reason is simple. Everything else in the film is a beautiful performance of a feeling. That scene is the feeling itself, given by the one person on the set who had the least reason to give the film anything at all, and gave it the most. She could not free Mammy from the lie that framed her, the fantasy of the happy slave who loves her owners. Nobody could have. What she could do, and did, was smuggle an entire real human being inside the costume, a woman with dignity and judgment and a heart, so that audiences who came to enjoy a comforting stereotype went home having watched, without quite realizing it, one of the finest performances of the age. She built it out of the exact thing that was meant to keep her small. That is not a small act. That is a whole art of resistance, hidden in plain sight, one raised eyebrow at a time. She had an answer ready for the people who criticized her, and she gave it plainly for the rest of her life. Why, she liked to ask, should she complain about earning good money playing a maid, when the only other option the world offered her was to earn almost nothing actually being won? It was not a surrender. It was a clear-eyed look at a narrow world. She had exactly two doors, and she chose the one that let her act and support her family, and sit at the edge of an industry that would not let her into the middle of it. Because make no mistake about what that industry was asking her, and Butterfly McQueen and all of them, to help it say. The film was telling America a story about slavery, and the story was a lie. It showed the enslaved people of Tara as happy, loyal and grateful, choosing to stay with their owners even after freedom came, as if bondage had been a warm family arrangement, rather than a system built on the whip and the auction block. The novel had gone further still, with cruder language the actors themselves objected to, and a version of the Ku Klux Klan drawn almost as heroes, and the film softened the worst of it, dropped the ugliest words, blurred the Klan into shadows. But softening a lie is not the same as telling the truth. The heart of the thing remained. The plantation was a paradise. The masters were kind. The war was a tragedy that fell on the innocent South from a cruel North. And the reason for the war, the buying and selling and breaking of human beings, was pushed so far into the background that you could watch all 4 hours and barely notice it was there. Look at how the film handles the moment freedom actually comes, and you can see the whole sleight of hand. In the real history, emancipation was the greatest thing that ever happened to the people of Tara, the end of a nightmare, the first morning of their lives as human beings who belonged to themselves. In the film, it is treated almost as a loss, a disruption, the good order of the old place coming undone. The loyal servants stay. The ones who leave, or the strangers who arrive freed and unsupervised, are drawn as figures of menace or foolishness, threats to the gentle white women of the story. The war's victors, the men who ended slavery, are the villains of the piece, and the defeated slaveholders are its wronged and gallant heroes. Everything is turned exactly upside down. The crime becomes the paradise, the liberation becomes the tragedy, and the audience, swept along by beauty and music and love, feels every bit of it in the wrong direction and never notices the trick. That is not a small distortion at the edge of an otherwise honest film. It is the engine at the center of the whole machine. There were other black performers on that lot carrying the same weight in quieter ways. Oscar Polk, a real stage veteran, played the butler pork with a gentleness that could not fully hide the man underneath. Eddie Anderson, already famous across the country for his rasping voice on the most popular radio show in America, took a small part as a coachman, a genuine star reduced to a bit of local color. Each of them had a full career and a full mind, and each was hired to be scenery in someone else's fantasy. And the fantasy had teeth. The novel had used the ugliest word in the language for black people freely, and had drawn the men of the Ku Klux Klan almost as gallant rescuers, with the noble Ashley riding among them. The black actors objected to the worst of the language, and the film, wary of the trouble the book had already stirred, dropped the vilest words and pushed the Klan into the shadows, never quite naming what those Night Riders were. But cleaning the mud off a lie does not make it true. What remained still told America that the men who terrorized freed people had been protecting something worth protecting. So the deepest of all the forbidden truths sat right there in the frame, hidden in plain sight. The most human, most dignified figure in the entire picture, the one audiences loved and the Academy would honor, was a black woman playing a happy slave in a film built to make her ancestors' chains disappear. She was carrying the film's soul and its lie at the same time, in the same body with the same face. Nobody was going to point at that and say it out loud. It was not a thing you could say. They finished the picture in the summer of 1939. It had cost close to $4 million, more than almost any film ever made, and swallowed 3 years and 3 directors, and a small army of writers, and one leading lady's peace of mind. Now it had to face the world, and Selznick was terrified. He had bet everything on it. His fortune, his father's name, his whole belief that a producer could be the author of a masterpiece. And until an audience actually sat in the dark and watched the thing, he could not know whether he had built a monument or a ruin. It ran nearly 4 hours, far longer than any ordinary picture. Would people sit still that long? Would they laugh in the wrong places? He had it quietly previewed for a real audience before the grand unveiling, slipped into a theater unannounced, and he sat in the back and watched the crowd more than the screen, reading their faces, listening for the silence that means a room is held. The room was held. People wept. When the lights came up, they did not want to leave. Only then, watching strangers cry over the thing he had nearly died making, did Selznick let himself believe he had not thrown his life away. The first place the finished film would truly face the public was the city where the story lived. Atlanta was going to throw the biggest party the South had seen since the war. It was still mourning. Almost everyone who made the film was invited. Almost. Atlanta, on the 15th of December in 1939, lost its mind with joy. The governor of Georgia declared the day a holiday. Schools and shops closed. Something like 1 million people, more than the whole city held, poured in from across the South and lined the streets 7 deep to watch. There were parades down Peachtree Street, and Confederate flags by the thousand, and old men in gray uniforms, and young women in the hoop skirts of their great-grandmothers, and bands and floodlights raking the winter sky. The stars came in by airplane to a screaming crowd at the field. Gable arrived with his new wife Carol, Lombard on his arm, and the two of them rode through the city in an open car, while the people roared as though a king and queen had come. Vivien Leigh was there, and Olivia de Havilland and Selznick, and the crowds pressed so close and cheered so hard that it frightened some of them. Leigh, the English girl, heard the band strike up the old Confederate anthem and turned to someone beside her, not quite understanding, and had to be told that to these people the war was not really over, not in the heart. For 3 days, the old capital of the Confederacy threw itself, a festival for a film about the war it had lost, and celebrated as though it had somehow at last and forever won. The theater itself, a great movie palace in the heart of the city, had been dressed on the outside with a tall white plantation front, columns and all, so that the audience walked into Tara to watch Tara. Searchlights swept the sky. Confederate veterans, real ones ancient now, were brought out and cheered. Women wore the hoop skirts of their great-grandmothers. For 3 nights, the old capital of the Confederacy held a festival for a war it had lost 80 years before, and it did not feel to the celebrants like sorrow. It felt like victory arriving very late. The black actors who had helped make it were not there. They could not be. Georgia's laws kept the races apart in its theaters, and its hotels and its ballrooms, and the studio, deciding it was safer and simpler, left Hattie McDaniel and Butterfly McQueen and the rest at home. The woman who gave the film its finest performance was not welcome in the city the film adored. Because of the color of the skin, the film had dressed in an apron. Her picture had been printed in the souvenir program and then removed because someone worried her face might offend the Southern crowd. She was good enough to honor on the screen and not good enough to stand in the lobby. The story goes that Gable, learning his friend and castmate had been shut out, threatened to skip the premiere entirely in protest, and that it was McDaniel herself who talked him out of it, who told him to go, to not make trouble, to let the picture have its night. Like the story of the signs, this one is warm and hard to fully prove, and it carries the same quiet ache, even in the versions where a white star wants to help. The black woman is the one who has to smooth it over, who has to protect everyone's comfort but her own, who has to give up her own anger so that the party can go on. If she said it out of a lifetime of knowing exactly how much anger the world would let her have, which was none. On the night before the great premiere, at a whites-only costume ball thrown to celebrate the film, a choir of black children from a local Baptist church was brought in to sing for the guests. They were dressed in the costumes of plantation slaves, little boys and girls in headscarves and rough clothes, singing spirituals as entertainment for white Atlanta in its finery. Among those children, it has long been said, was a 10-year-old boy whose father was the pastor of that church, a serious, watchful child named Martin. If the story is right, and it appears to be, then Martin Luther King Jr. spent one evening of his boyhood dressed as a slave, singing for the pleasure of people, celebrating a film that told the world slavery had been a kindness. History does not always arrange its ironies gently. The film opened, and it conquered everything. It ran nearly 4 hours, with a musical overture before it began and an intermission in the middle, sold as a grand event rather than an ordinary night at the pictures, with tickets that cost more than usual and seats you reserved in advance. And people paid it gladly. They came in their best clothes. They wept and cheered and came back to see it a second and a third time. The reviews called it one of the great achievements of the movies, and for once the reviews and the crowds agreed. It is worth remembering what kind of country it opened in. America in 1939 was climbing out of 10 years of the Great Depression, 10 years of breadlines, and lost farms and men riding the rails looking for work. And a war was already burning in Europe that everyone could feel would reach them soon. Into that tired, frightened country came 4 hours of color and passion and survival. A story about a woman who loses everything and refuses to lie down, who claws a radish out of the dirt and swears she will never be beaten. People did not just watch Scarlett O'Hara, they needed her. She was every family that had held on through the worst decade in memory, dressed up in a hoop skirt and made beautiful. That hunger is part of why the film went so deep and stayed so long. It arrived exactly when a battered people wanted to be told that endurance would be rewarded, and it told them so for 4 glorious hours. And they loved it for the telling, and they did not look too hard at the lie folded inside the comfort. It became the most successful film anyone had ever made, a record it would hold by the honest measure of tickets sold for the rest of the century and beyond. People who had never opened a history book about the Civil War now had one in their heads, 4 hours long and in glorious color, and they believed it. The lie had become the most popular thing in America, and it ended on 2 lines that the whole country would come to know by heart. Near the finish, when Scarlett has finally driven Red away and begs him to tell her what she will do without him, he turns at the door and tells her, plainly and forever, that he no longer cares, in a single flat sentence that landed like a slap and became perhaps the most famous closing exchange in the history of the movies. It shocked people in 1939, that hard little word at the end of it, and the studio had to fight to keep it in. And then, alone in the wreck of everything she wanted, Scarlett squares her shoulders and tells herself that tomorrow is another day, that she will think about it all tomorrow, that she will find a way to get him back. The credits roll on a woman who has lost love and land and family, and still refuses to believe she is beaten. It is a magnificent ending, and it is the whole seduction of the thing in miniature. You leave not thinking about the enslaved people who built that beautiful house. You leave thinking about the brave, stubborn, unbreakable girl standing in front of it, and you love her, and you carry her home. That is exactly how the lie kept winning. It hid inside a heroine you could not help but admire. And then came the night this whole story started with, the night of the small table by the wall. The Academy Awards were held that year at a hotel in Los Angeles, at a club called the Coconut Grove, and Gone with the Wind arrived with more nominations than any film had ever gathered, and it was going to win almost all of them. Vivien Leigh was there, thin and luminous and drained. Selznick was there, about to be handed the prize he had nearly died chasing. And Hattie McDaniel was there too, nominated for Best Supporting Actress, the first black performer ever nominated for anything, in a gown of blue with white gardenias in her hair. The club had a rule: no black guests. The building where the movie industry gathered to hand out its highest honors did not, as a matter of policy, admit people of her color at all. The studio had to telephone ahead and ask, as a special favor, for permission to bring in the woman they had nominated for an award. Permission was granted on conditions. She would not be seated with the cast she had spent months making the film alongside, the people she had bled the same long day with under the same roasting lights. She was placed at a small table set against the far wall, off to the side, with her escort and her agent, 3 chairs pushed against the edge of the room so that the rule could be bent just far enough to let her attend her own triumph without spoiling anyone's dinner. Think about the arithmetic of that night from where she sat. She had already been shut out of the Atlanta premiere. Her photograph had been pulled from the program so as not to trouble a Southern crowd. Now she sat at the industry's grandest evening as its guest of honor and its outcast in the same hour, watching the tables of white stars laugh and toast across a room she was not allowed to cross, except when her name was called. And she had written a speech anyway and worked on it and folded it into her glove in case. When her name was read as the winner, a small sound went through the room and then applause, and she rose from that table by the wall. She had to walk the long way to reach the stage, the whole length of the ballroom, past table after table of the white stars and studio chiefs who had made the picture with her and gone home each night to a different city than she did. She walked it alone in her blue gown, with the gardenias in her hair, a big woman carrying herself very straight, and she climbed the steps to the microphone. Her voice shook. She had worked on the words and she read them carefully, and partway through the tears came, and she had to gather herself to go on. She thanked the Academy for its kindness. She said she hoped she would always be a credit to her race and to the motion picture industry. It was a careful speech, a grateful speech, the only kind of speech a black woman could safely give in that room in that year. Every word chosen to give no offense to the people who held her whole future in their hands. And then she turned and walked the long way back, past all those tables again, and sat down once more at the little table against the wall, alone with her escort and her agent, apart from the celebration going on in the middle of the room. She had made history. She had won the highest honor her profession could give. She was the first of her people ever to hold that award. And the moment truly did open a door, however narrow, that could never quite be shut again. All of that is real, and all of it matters. And all of it happened to a woman who was not allowed to sit with her friends in a room that celebrated a film about how happy her grandmother had surely been in her chains. Lee won Best Actress that same night, exhausted, and thanked the man who had run her ragged. The film won Best Picture and Best Director for the one man out of the 4 who had steered it. It won for the writing, the prize going to Sidney Howard, dead almost a year by then, the first man ever to win that award after his own death. It won for the color photography and the art direction and the editing. When the counting was done, it had taken 8 of the competitive prizes and 2 special ones besides, more than any film had ever gathered, out of 13 nominations, and it became the first film shot in full color ever named the best picture of its year. It won and won and won, and through all of it, over against the wall, sat the truest thing the film had produced, honored and held apart in the same breath, in a room where not one soul stood up and named what everyone could see, because you could not name it. That was the whole point of how the room was built. The party ended, the awards went home, the film rolled on into legend. But the forbidden truth did not go anywhere. It just went quiet and waited the way buried things do. For the next 50 years, the film did not fade. It came back again and again, a fresh release every few years. In 1947 and 1954 and 1961 and 1967, and on into the 70s and beyond, each time drawing new crowds who had grown up being told it was the greatest film ever made. In those decades before people owned movies at home, the only way to see it was to buy a ticket when it came around. And it always came around, and there was always a line. Gable used to say that whenever his star began to dim, another release of Gone with the Wind would light it right back up. He was right. It kept resurrecting his fame and everyone else's for the rest of their lives. When it finally came to television in 1976, split across 2 nights, more Americans gathered to watch it than had ever gathered to watch almost anything. A record audience settling in front of their sets to see Scarlet and Red, and the burning of Atlanta in their own living rooms. Whole families sat together and took it in as a single shared event. By then it had been counted among the first films the country chose to preserve forever, as part of its official memory, set aside as a national treasure. It was no longer a movie. It had become furniture in the national mind, so familiar that questioning it felt almost rude. And here is the quiet harm folded inside all that love. For millions of people, this film was not a film. It was history. It was the only version of the Civil War, and the years after it they ever really took in. They never read the letters of the enslaved. They never read the speeches of the men who led the South, who wrote in plain words that they were fighting to keep human beings as property. They watched a beautiful movie about a brave girl and a gracious world brought low by cruel outsiders, and they carried that picture in their heads for the rest of their lives and passed it to their children. A lie told well enough and loved long enough stops feeling like a lie. It starts feeling like memory. The people who made it, meanwhile, went on to live out the endings of their own stories, and almost none of those endings were what the glamour promised. Vivien Leigh married her Laurence Olivier in the summer of 1940, and for a while they were the most admired couple in the acting world. The beautiful Oliviers, royalty of the stage, but the illness the film had helped bring to the surface never let her go. In 1944, she was found to have tuberculosis, and it would come and go for the rest of her life. In 1945, she lost a baby she was carrying and fell into the first of the deep, frightening breakdowns that would return again and again. The black side of the swinging illness in her mind. She could climb into brilliance and then drop into a place no one could reach. There is a hard, perfect symmetry in what happened to her next. A dozen years after Scarlet, she took another role, another Southern woman, and it was Scarlet turned inside out. In A Streetcar Named Desire, she played Blanche DuBois, a fading Southern belle whose grip on the world is slipping away, a woman clinging to the ruins of a genteel old life that no longer exists, and to the kindness of strangers, because she has nothing else left to hold. Where Scarlet had been all steel and survival, Blanche was all cracks and pretending, and Leigh understood Blanche better than any actress alive could have, because by then, she was living a version of the very same unraveling, the beautiful woman losing her hold on what was real. She won her second Oscar for it, the only British actress ever to take that prize twice. And then the people who loved her began to worry aloud that the part had cost her too, that spending months inside the skin of a woman going mad had pulled her own troubled mind further out to sea. Her marriage to Olivier, the great love she had crossed an ocean for, wore down through the years of her illness and his exhaustion, the two of them famous and admired and quietly coming apart, until at last in 1960 they let it go. The most envied couple in the acting world could not survive the thing that was happening inside her. Her health kept failing through the years that followed. She turned at the end, cool toward the role that had made her, saying she had never really liked Scarlet, that the girl was hard and grasping, and not someone she wished to be remembered for, though of course she would be forever. In the summer of 1967, alone in her London flat while her companion was out, she tried to walk to the bathroom, and her ruined lungs filled with fluid, and she sank to the floor and could not get up. She was 53. That night the theaters of London put out their lights for an hour, the way a city dims itself for one of its own. The girl who walked out of the firelight in Culver City had burned all the way down. Clark Gable's ending came with its own long grief. During the making of the film, he had finally married his Carole Lombard, the happiest thing in his life, and for 3 years, they were the couple everyone envied, calling each other Ma and Pa on their ranch outside Los Angeles. Then in January of 1942, with the country newly at war, Lombard flew home from a war bond rally where she had raised a fortune for the fight, and her plane went into a mountain in the Nevada dark and killed everyone aboard. Gable was 30 pounds of joy lighter for the rest of his life. He walked away from the movies and enlisted in the Army Air Forces at 41, flew combat missions over Germany, and came home a decorated man and a hollowed one. He kept working, kept being the king, but the easy light in him was mostly gone. His last film was a sad, beautiful thing called The Misfits, an aging cowboy in a modern world that no longer had a place for him, and he did his own hard-riding stunts in it, and 2 days after it wrapped, his heart gave out. He died in November of 1960, 59 years old, and he never saw the film, and he never met the son his wife was carrying. They buried him beside Carole Lombard, where he had asked to be, next to the 3 years that had been the best of his life. The gentle man who played Ashley met the war head-on and did not come back from it. Leslie Howard, who had taken the part with a shrug and thought himself too old and too English for it, threw himself into the fight against Hitler once it came, making films and broadcasts to steady British spirits. In the summer of 1943, the airliner carrying him home across the Bay of Biscay was found by German fighters and shot down into the sea, and everyone aboard was lost. He was 50, the reluctant Ashley, the dreamer who never quite fit the doomed world around him, died in the realist war of the century, defending the country he loved, while the fake war he had acted in went on filling theaters back home. David Selznick got what he had chased his whole life, and it broke something in him to have it. He had made the biggest film in the world, proved his father's ruined name could rise again, shown that a producer could be the true author of a picture. The very next year, he did something almost no one has ever done. He won the Best Picture prize a second time in a row for a dark and elegant thriller called Rebecca, so that for one brief stretch, he sat on top of the whole industry twice over, untouchable. And then he spent the rest of his career trying to feel that height again, and never could. Nothing he made after ever came close to Gone with the Wind, and he knew it, and the knowing wore at him like water on stone. He had climbed the highest mountain in his world before he was 40, and everything after was the long walk down the far side of it, in the shadow of the thing he had already done. He died in 1965, still chasing the height of one December in 1939, a man undone in the end, less by failure than by a success too big to ever repeat. There is even a small, strange justice buried in his triumph. Olivia de Havilland, the gentle Melanie, had been loaned out to make the film by her home studio, and she came out of that era so worn down by the way the studios owned and traded their actors like livestock that she took her studio to court over it and won. The ruling that still carries her name loosened the iron grip the studios held on the people who worked for them and gave actors a measure of freedom they had never had. The system that made Gone with the Wind possible was cracked open, in part, by one of the women who had stood inside it in a hoop skirt. And she went on and on. She outlived every one of them. Every star and director and producer who had sweated on that lot outlived the century itself, living all the way to 104 years old, clear-eyed and sharp to the end. For decades, she was the last living link to the whole enterprise, the only person left who remembered the red dirt and the roasting lights, and the sound of Vivien Leigh laughing between takes firsthand. When she finally died in 2020, in the same summer the country was arguing all over again about what the film had done. The last hand that had touched the making of it let go. Everyone who built the beautiful lie was gone. Only the lie and the truth standing beside it remained. And Margaret Mitchell, the small, sharp woman who started all of it on a couch with a bad ankle, never wrote another novel. The fame she had dreaded swallowed the rest of her life whole. She spent her years answering the flood of letters, guarding what privacy she could, insisting to anyone who asked that the book was only a story and she was only its author, nothing more. She had written the most read novel of her age, and it had made her a prisoner of it. On a summer evening in 1949, 10 years after the film, she was crossing Peachtree Street in Atlanta with her husband, on their way to see a movie, when a speeding car came out of the dusk and struck her down in the road. She lingered a few days and then she was gone, 48 years old, killed on a street in the very city she had turned into a myth. She had spent her whole life inside a warm and lovely story about a South that never quite existed, and she went to her grave without ever fully seeing that the warmth of it was spread over a wound. She had been taught, from her earliest days on the old men's knees, never to look at directly. None of them were monsters. That is the thing to hold on to as you count the graves, because it would be easier if they were. Mitchell wrote down the only history, the old men on the porches had ever given her, and she died before the country made her look again. And she went to her grave, believing she had written the truth about a place she loved. Selznick built a cathedral and could not see the ground it stood on, a man so busy controlling the color of a dress that he never once thought to ask what his beautiful film was teaching a nation about its darkest crime. Gable did what small, brave things he could, and let the stories of them grow taller than the facts, because the world always needs a hero in the frame, and he was the closest one to hand. Lee gave her fragile mind to a role she came to resent, and paid for it for the rest of her short life. They were people, blind in the ordinary ways their whole time made nearly everyone blind, doing their work inside a system that had taught them not to see the thing sitting in the middle of the room. The kindness they showed each other was real, so was the harm they did without ever meaning to. The film they made together is beautiful, genuinely, one of the most skilled things the movies ever produced. And the film they made together is a lie, a warm and lovely lie, that shaped how millions of people understood the worst thing their country ever did. Both of those are simply true at the same time. And the grown-up thing, the only honest thing, is to hold them both and refuse to let go of either one. But there is one grave we have not stood at yet, the most important one, the woman from the small table by the wall. After the Oscar, Hattie McDaniel kept working, because the honor did not change the doors that were open to her. She made hundreds of films across her life, and the record gives her screen credit on only 83 of them. And in most of them, she played the same handful of maids and cooks, because that was what Hollywood would hire a black woman to be. The award on her shelf, the first her people had ever won, did not buy her a single new kind of part. It only proved that she could be the best in the world at a role the world would never let her escape. Her win was a complicated joy for Black America, and it is worth being honest about that too, because nothing here is simple. For a great many Black readers and listeners, the night she rose from that little table and took the prize was a source of real and deep pride. One of their own standing at the summit of an industry that had shut them out, proved that the ceiling could crack. The Black press covered it as history because it was, and at the very same time, others looked at what she had won it for, a happy slave in a film that lied about slavery, and felt the pride curdle. Both feelings were true, and often they lived in the same person at once, the swell of seeing her honored, and the ache of seeing what she had to play to be honored. She stood in the middle of that split, feeling for the rest of her life, a symbol to some and a disappointment to others. And underneath the symbol, she was only a woman trying to work. She caught it from both sides, which is the cruelest kind of trap. White America wanted her smiling and servile, and would give her nothing else. And a growing number of her own people, fighting harder every year for dignity and equality, looked at those maid roles and felt she was holding the whole race back, playing the very picture of Black womanhood they were trying to bury. Leaders of the movement pressed her to stop. It stung because they were her people, and because in a way they were right, and in another way, they had no idea what it was to have exactly two doors and choose the one that let you act. She answered them the only way she knew, with that clear plane which she had carried up from Denver. She would rather play a maid, she liked to say, than be one, and earned $700 a week doing the first when the world would pay her $7 doing the second. It was not a boast, it was arithmetic, and it was true. And underneath, it was a whole life of knowing exactly how narrow the road was, and walking it with her head up anyway. She did more than survive it. She had bought herself a fine house in a pretty Los Angeles neighborhood, a home she was proud of. And when the white property owners around her tried to use the rules of the day to force the Black families out, saying people of their color had no right to own homes on that street, she did not quietly move. She stood and she helped fight it. And the battle went all the way up through the courts, as part of the long war that finally got those cruel property rules struck down for good. The woman the movement scolded for playing maids was, off the screen, in the fight for real in her own front yard. She broke onto the radio, too, as the first Black woman in the country to carry her own network show, playing a warm, wise housekeeper named Beulah. And then she carried the part onto television, when television was brand new. It was still on paper a maid, but now the maid was the star of the program, the name in the title, the center of the story, rather than the furniture at the edge of it. And a whole country tuned in every week to hear her. She kept giving to black causes, quietly, out of her own pocket. She did what she could inside the cage the Times had built around her, and by the way she carried herself, she made the cage a little wider for everyone who would come after her and find the bars already bent. Then in the early 1950s, her health began to fail. There was heart trouble, and then the worst news, breast cancer, and it did not let go. She faced it the way she had faced everything, without much fuss, still working when she could, still gracious to the people around her. She died in October of 1952, in the city that had honored her and held her at arm's length in the same breath. Something like 3,000 people came to say goodbye to her, filling the church and spilling out into the street, and a long line of cars followed her to her rest. She was 59 years old, the same age Gable would be when his heart gave out 8 years later, both of them worn down early by lives that had asked a great deal. She had left careful instructions, and they tell you everything about how she saw herself. She asked for a white casket and a white shroud. She asked for white gardenias in her hair and in her hands, the same white gardenias she had worn the night she won, the flower of her one great victory carried with her into the ground. And she asked to be buried in the Hollywood Cemetery, the beautiful resting place of the movie stars, the Fairbanks and the Valentinos, the ground reserved for the immortals of the industry she had served all her life. The cemetery said no. Its owner would not take her because she was black, and the Cemetery of the Stars did not bury black people. She had won the highest honor her profession could give, and her own industry's hallowed ground turned her away at the gate. So they buried her instead a few miles south, in a cemetery that took people of every color, the first in the city that would. She got the white casket and the gardenias. She did not get the one plot she asked for. Segregation, as one writer put it, followed her all the way to the grave. Even the award itself did not stay. Her Oscar had not been the tall gold figure the big winners carried home. In those years, the supporting players received a small plaque instead, a lesser object for a lesser category. And there is a quiet, awful fitness in that too. The first black winner in the history of the prize handed a smaller version of it. She treasured it anyway, and when she died, she left it to Howard University, one of the great black colleges, so that young black students walking those halls could stop and look at it, and know that the door had been opened, that one of them had done it, that it was possible. For years it sat there, and students did stop and look. And then, sometime in the decades after, the plaque simply disappeared from the campus. No theft was ever solved. No trail was ever found. To this day, no one knows for certain where the first Oscar ever given to a black performer went. The proof of her history vanished quietly into nothing, the way so much of the record of black achievement in this country was allowed to slip away unguarded, as if it had never mattered enough for anyone to keep safe. Long after, the industry made a fresh copy and gave it back to the college, a replacement for a history that should never have been let go in the first place. It would take almost 50 years, near the end of the century, before the Hollywood Cemetery that had refused her offered to bring her home at last. Her family, in the end, chose to leave her where she rested, but the cemetery built a memorial to her anyway, a stone that stands over the water where the tourists walk, so that her name would be spoken in the place that once shut its gates against her. The inscription says it is there to honor her last wish. It does not say that the wish went unhonored for half a century, or that she is not actually buried beneath it. Even the apology is a little bit of a story we tell to feel better. That is the deepest of the forbidden truths, and it was never really hidden at all. It was standing in the middle of the frame the whole time, in a face the whole country loved. For a long time, the country could not say it. The film was too loved, and the myth inside it was too comfortable, and the people it hurt did not have a microphone loud enough to be heard over the applause. When black groups protested the film at its release, warning that it would spread the very lies it did spread, the mainstream press mostly waved them off or ignored them. The objection was there from the very first day. It was simply not allowed to matter. Slowly over the decades, that changed. Historians took the myth apart piece by piece and showed the war for what it plainly was, a war to keep human beings as property, dressed up afterward as a war about honor. The men who led the South had not been shy about it at the time. They had written it down, in their own founding documents and their own famous speeches, that the thing they were fighting to preserve was the ownership of black people. It was only later, once they had lost, that the story got rewritten into something a defeated people could live with, a noble lost cause about states and honor, and a gentle way of life. The gentle way of life had never existed. The paradise the film painted, with its happy servants and kindly masters, was the exact opposite of the thing itself. Slavery was forced labor held in place by the whip and the gun. It was families torn apart on auction blocks, children sold away from mothers, women with no right to say no to the men who owned them. Human beings worked until they broke and then replaced. And when freedom finally came, the enslaved did not, by and large, weep and beg to stay, the way the film shows. Many walked off the moment they could, went looking for the family that had been sold away, built schools and churches and lives of their own, and were beaten back down for years by men who could not stand to see it. The film took all of that, the whole enormous crime and the whole enormous struggle, and painted over it with a picture of loyal old servants who loved their masters and missed the good old days. Scholars stopped treating the film as a record of the Old South and started treating it as a record of the 1930s that made it, a mirror held up not to the Civil War at all, but to the country that, 70 years later, still wanted so badly to believe a soft story about it. The film did not change. What people were finally allowed to see in it did. In our own century, the reckoning came into the open. In 2017, a beloved old movie palace in Memphis, which had shown the film every summer for years as a treat, quietly dropped it from the schedule after enough of its own audience said the picture of race in it caused real pain to sit through. The decision made national news, and the arguments began, the same arguments that would keep coming. Then came the summer of 2020. In the weeks after George Floyd was killed under a policeman's knee, the whole country turned to look hard at the statues and the symbols and the stories it had been living beside without really seeing. And the film got caught in that reckoning. A writer laid out the case plainly in a newspaper that a film glorifying the Confederacy and its comfortable lies about slavery should not simply sit on a streaming service as ordinary entertainment with nothing said. The service pulled it down for a short while, which set off a storm, people shouting about censorship and erasing history. Then it came back, unchanged, exactly as it always was, but now with something new set in front of it. An introduction by a black film scholar who spoke calmly and clearly about what the movie was, what it was made of, what it had done to the country's memory, the beauty and the lie laid down side by side. Nothing was cut, nothing was hidden. The film was simply, at last, told the truth about, right before you watched it. Some called that censorship. Others called it the first honest thing anyone had done with the film in 80 years. What both sides were really arguing about was whether the forbidden truth could finally be said out loud, in the light, standing right next to the thing itself. And the answer, after all that time, turned out to be yes. None of that has made the film go away, and it is worth being fair about why. Millions of people still love it, and not because they hate anyone or wish the old days back. They love the sweep of it, the color, the music, the doomed romance, the unbreakable girl at the heart of it. They love it the way you love a thing your mother loved, handed down warm through a family. That love is real, and it is not in itself a sin. The trouble was never that people found the film beautiful. It is beautiful. The trouble was that, for the better part of a century, the beauty was allowed to stand alone, with no one permitted to say, gently and firmly and at the same time. And also, this is not what happened. You are allowed to love a thing and tell the truth about it. That, in the end, is all the reckoning ever asked. Today, the film is often described as something like a monument, the kind of stone Confederate memorial that stands in a southern square, except made of light and shadow and Max Steiner's music, beautiful, skilled, and built to tell a lie that a whole region needed to keep believing. When cities across the South began, in these last years, taking down the stone generals from their pedestals, people started to ask the obvious question about the most famous Confederate monument of all, the one that was not stone but film, the one that could not be pulled off a pedestal, because it lived in 100 million memories instead. You cannot crane a movie out of a public square. It is already inside people, handed down from grandparents who saw it new, folded into how a country pictures its own past. That is the hardest part of the whole story, and the part that keeps it alive. The film did its work so well, so beautifully over so many years, that for millions of Americans, it simply became the past, more real than any textbook, more vivid than any photograph. It is still preserved, still studied, still screened, though now more as evidence than as history, a way to understand not the old South it pretends to show, but the country that made it and loved it and needed it to be true. The house in Atlanta, where Margaret Mitchell wrote it, once a shrine to her and her book, reopened not long ago with a new kind of exhibit, one that finally tries to hold both things in the same room at the same time. The artistry and the harm, the pride of the city that made the story, and the pain of the people, the story erased. It took the better part of a century to build a room honest enough to say both out loud. That is how long the forbidden truth stayed forbidden, not by law but by love. Which brings us back at the end to a small table pushed against a far wall in a hotel ballroom full of gold light on a February night in 1940. Picture her there one more time, now that you know the whole of it. A woman in a blue gown with white gardenias in her hair, the same flowers she would ask to be buried in, sitting apart from the people she made the picture with, waiting to hear whether the industry that would not seat her beside her friends would nonetheless call her name. It called her name. She rose and she crossed that room the long way past all of them, and she stood at the microphone with her voice shaking and thanked the people who had drawn the line she had just walked across. And she said she hoped to always be a credit to her race. Then she went back to the table by the wall. She was, in that single moment, the most honored and the most humiliated person in the room, and both at once. And she carried it with a grace that costs more than most people ever have to spend. That is the forbidden truth behind Gone with the Wind, the one nobody in that room could say, and nobody for 2 generations would. The most beautiful film Hollywood ever made was also the most beautiful lie it ever told, and the truest, most human thing in all 4 hours of it. The dignity and the wit and the plain, hard love that Hattie McDaniel poured into a part built to demean her was given by a woman the film's own world would not seat at the table, would not let into the city where the story lived, and would not bury where she asked to lie. The lie was up on the screen in glorious color, a happy old South that never was. The truth was standing right in front of the camera the whole time, in an apron, being told to smile. It was never hidden. That is what makes it forbidden. You did not have to dig for it. You only had to be willing to look at the face the country loved and see the whole life it refused to see. And almost nobody was willing for a very long time. She wanted white gardenias in her hair, and she got them at her triumph and at her grave. She wanted to rest among the immortals, and they turned her away and honored her anyway once it was safe, and she was long past caring. She played a woman who loved a family that owned her, and she made that woman more real and more alive than anyone thought the part could hold. And she did it as the granddaughter of people who had actually been owned, in an industry that owned her a little too. The film will outlast all of us, and it should kept and shown and argued over, the great flawed thing that it is. But if you watch it now, watch her. Watch the woman at the edge of the frame, who is carrying more truth in one look than the whole grand lie around her. She knew what she was doing.